war is a great accelerator of inventions and their exploitation. If peace had generally prevailed in the first half of the 20th century, as it had done for most of the 19th, the innovations of the Wright brothers and Blériot would no doubt have been slow to mature. Furthermore, the ways in which they did develop might have proved irrelevant to the needs of warfare. War in itself, much more than in the possible prospects of it, generates the most important advances in machinery and weapons. None more so than airships and aeroplanes, which were seized by the compelling appetite of war when they were scarcely beyond their early age of infancy. Before the First World War, flying had caught the imagination of the public, and within a short space of just a few years, all of the major nations were developing aircraft. Louis Blériot had taken the first major step forward in powered flight when in June 1909 he became the first person to fly across the English Channel. This confirmed the belief amongst some countries that aircraft could eventually have a military role. Germany was one of those countries. As early as 1884, she had developed the use of lighter-than-air balloons as observation platforms, and by 1910, out of the 26 large airships in the world, 14 of them were German. But the military was still not convinced of the aircraft's ability as a weapon of war. Although the armies involved had planned at the outset that this was going to be a war fought by a campaign of movement, it was quite the reverse. The First World War was to become a war of the trenches. The armies found themselves caught in a static struggle between increasingly sophisticated and ever denser defense systems. Two giant armies of equal strength were trapped, facing each other in a network of trenches with no way forward and no way back. But as the war progressed, so too did the development of new weapons and machinery. The sheer power of new mass-produced weaponry then available gave the armies no alternative but to go to ground, for this was above all a war of artillery, the German army being much better equipped at the time with heavy guns. The tank was also going to prove its worth. The mortar was used for the first time. And hand grenades, which had become obsolete 200 years previously, were again brought into use. Perhaps one of the most important advances in mechanized weaponry was the machine gun. The very nature of warfare itself was rapidly undergoing a metamorphosis, with new techniques in artillery and infantry tactics. With the position of each side and the location of reinforcements becoming more and more important, it became increasingly necessary to find an alternative and more accurate and comprehensive means of reconnaissance. This was traditionally carried out by the cavalry, but far-sighted powers felt that here was an ideal use for the aeroplane. It became obvious that the chief thing an aircraft could do in war was survey the enemy. Two-seater scout aircraft were sent out by both sides to monitor enemy movements and positions. Special cameras were developed for use by the observer. On occasions, these scout aircraft also dropped primitive bombs on the ground troops below. But as intelligence of enemy movements became more valuable, it also paid an opponent to try and prevent its gathering. And aircraft soon began to arm themselves, first with rifles and revolvers, and then with mounted machine guns. The types that had been specifically designed and used for reconnaissance by Germany were all similar in specification. Companies such as Albatros, Rumpler, Pfalz and Aviatik all produced aircraft for the role. Originally, the pilot had sat in the rear seat with the observer seated up front, but this was later reversed when it was found that the gun position mounted in the rear had a much better arc of defensive fire away from the hindrance of the wing struts and braces. Most of them were powered with Mercedes engines and could fly at speeds of nearly 150 kilometers an hour with a flying ceiling of around 5,000 meters. Designers soon began to think of aircraft not just as platforms of observation, but as fighting machines. These new fighting scouts, as they were called, first appeared in 1915 and began to do battle with each other. The British adapted their original reconnaissance machines, such as the FE-2B, with its added armament on a free rotating ring fired by the observer. But in Germany, things were different. The Dutch designer Fokker came up with a new machine specifically designed for the job. The Fokker monoplane. This was fitted with an interrupter gear to make it possible to fire directly through the propeller, thus enabling the pilot to aim the aircraft at its target. A fundamental principle of air power emerged: the ulterior motive, observation of the enemy. The appearance of the Fokker monoplane in May 1915 placed a new meaning on this concept. It was the very first fighter or pursuit aircraft in history. Very soon the British pilots were talking of the Fokker Scourge. Germany also took the lead in aerial warfare in another development of the aircraft, for they were the first to determine that if an aircraft could fly over enemy lines to observe them, could they not also drop explosives on them, and furthermore, could they not also fly behind enemy lines and bomb targets behind them? Aircraft had not yet been designed with a long enough range, but Germany did have the Zeppelins. They could cruise for hours and carry much heavier loads than any scout or fighter aircraft. Germany opened a campaign of aerial bombing against England. The first target was Yarmouth on the night of January the 19th, 1915. Thereafter, attacks were increased until on the night of the 31st of May, 14 airships attacked and bombed London. This caused much outcry and outrage out of all proportion to the damage actually inflicted on the city. The British, used to comparative immunity from the effects of war, had not expected any such intrusion. There were 51 such attacks during the war, dropping over 200 tons of bombs on the city. During the course of 1916, it became apparent that something much faster and more maneuverable than an airship was needed if that sort of attack was to be maintained and increased. Germany's determination to find a solution produced a chain reaction, which in fact governed the nature of air power until the arrival of guided missiles and nuclear weapons almost half a century later. Early in 1917, Germany introduced a new breed of aircraft into service. This was the twin-engined Gotha bomber. The Gotha was the very first authentic long-range heavy bomber in the history of aviation. On June the 13th, 1917, a formation of 14 Gotha bombers appeared over the centre of London in broad daylight and dropped 118 bombs in the city centre. Nearly 100 British fighters went up to engage the German bombers, but failed. All 14 aircraft returned safely to their base in Belgium. There were immediate repercussions. 2 British fighter squadrons were brought back from France to reinforce the defences of London. Meanwhile, the bombers returned once again, inflicting further damage on the capital. In 1914, when World War I had begun, the aeroplane was still a crude, powered box kite of dubious strength and reliability. But with the advent of the Fokker monoplane and the various aircraft that were rapidly brought off the drawing boards into the air soon afterwards, the new breed of aeroplane, and in particular the Fighting Scout, were rapidly becoming much more sophisticated. By the end of 1915, the new fighters, in a rapid attempt by the opposing forces' determination to deny each other the advantages of aerial observation, were relatively reliable aerobatic weapons. One of these new fighting scouts to come off the drawing boards was the Albatros. Manufactured in 1915 by the Albatros Flugzeugwerk over 80 years ago, this aircraft, which has now been restored to its original specification, belongs to Cole Palin's old Rhinebeck Aerodrome in the state of New York. This is an Albatros D-Series variant, which was their single-seater fighter scout. It was powered by Mercedes' six-cylinder inline water-cooled engine, which developed 160 horsepower. Later variants had 150 horsepower and 180 horsepower engines. One of the problems with flying aircraft from this period, according to the pilots who fly them today, is that landing them can be difficult. The aircraft weren't fitted with brakes, and once on the ground, the pilot had to cut the engine whilst the ground crews would run alongside and catch the aircraft. There was also no steering mechanism, so once you'd landed, you were quite simply out of control of your aircraft. It would be up to the ground crews to slow you down and get you pointed in the right direction before bringing the aircraft to a standstill. The Albatros was fitted with twin Spandau machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller. If attacked from behind, the pilot had absolutely no defense other than to take evasive action to avoid being shot down. The streamlined fuselage gave the aircraft a pleasing appearance with almost graceful lines and curves. The great German air ace Oswald Boelcke flew an Albatros, as did the legendary Baron Manfred von Richthofen. In fact, Richthofen scored many of his 80 victories in an aircraft just like this one. The fuselage of this aircraft is made of wood, unlike its counterpart, which were covered in canvas. The standard colour scheme was a natural wood finish with painted wings and markings depending on which squadron the aircraft belonged to. Von Richthofen, however, broke tradition. His aircraft was painted in bright red. When he started his flying career as an observer, he had originally flown in the earlier variant of the Albatros, which was the C-type. Albatros, although overshadowed by the rival Fokker factory and their potent fighters, probably produced in terms of engineering and quality the best all-round fighters and reconnaissance aircraft of the war. Both the C-types and the later D-types were startlingly efficient aircraft and played an enormous part in achieving and retaining air superiority in the skies over the battlefields of France. The first Albatros C-type left the factory in 1915. This was a two-seater version with pilot and navigator. The C designating the type given by the military for an armed reconnaissance aircraft. The C-1 had entered service in the spring of 1915 and served in substantial numbers. Its performance was such that it was able to carry out light bombing tasks and aerial photography in addition to its intended role. It was a compact and sturdy aircraft which carried out its role well into 1917 and even then continued in secondary roles. The D-type Albatros, which was the single-seater fighter version of this aircraft, was first delivered to the squadrons in December 1916. The D-1 was soon followed by the D-2, and later the D-3, D-4 and D-5. The D-3 was perhaps the most effective version of the Albatros fighter scouts, with a modified wing and an upgraded engine. Oswald Boelcke had developed his famous principles of air fighting while flying in an Albatros, and the aircraft became the major equipment of the 37 Yastas, which had by then been formed. Their original role was to offer protection to the two-seater scout planes on reconnaissance missions. As the war progressed, however, this use changed to a primary defense role. They would be sent out to lay in wait for the Allied two-seaters to cross the line, whereupon they would attack, usually coming from out of the sun, with devastating success. The Albatros works were known for their quality of production, and although other factories also produced the Albatros under license, the main factory's aircraft proved far more reliable. Albatros also produced aircraft under license from other manufacturers, including their main rival, Fokker. And it's interesting that even when producing another manufacturer's aircraft, their quality was superb. It was well known that the Fokkers produced under license by the Albatros factory proved far more sturdy and reliable than those that came out of Fokker's own factory. This was partly due to the fact that Albatros had access to much better and more powerful engines than Fokker and were quick to secure most of the new engines that Mercedes could produce. The Albatros works were also much larger and better equipped than Fokker's smaller and almost ramshackle works. The Fokker Scourge, as it was known, was brought to an end by the British and French in time for the opening of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. New aircraft, such as these French Nieuport babies, helped bring about that turn in air superiority, as did the introduction of the British pusher aircraft, the FE-2B. This aircraft had a top speed of 140 kilometers an hour and was surprisingly maneuverable for a pusher type. By the winter of 1916, however, with Germany now using the new Albatros and similar types, the tide of air power was turning yet again in favor of Germany, and French and British aircraft losses mounted heavily. The new German aircraft had far better performance and were much more capable in battle than their enemy. It was at this time in the war, at the suggestion of one of Germany's top fighter aces, Oswald Bolker, that the fighters began to operate in the air in complete squadrons of 14 aircraft. This gave them numerical superiority over their opponents. The French began using various types of new SPAD aircraft, both single and two-seater variants. They also introduced the Nieuport 17, some of which were used by the British alongside the Sopwith Pup. This was their first effective single-seat fighting scout, which was first operated at the end of 1916. The Pup was joined by the Sopwith triplane, the two-seater Bristol fighter affectionately known as the Brisfit, and shown here the FE-5, which proved itself to be one of the best fighters of the war. It was not, however, speed which gave these aircraft the edge. Indeed, during the 4 years of war, this rose no more than about 60 kilometers an hour from the 130 or 140 kilometers an hour achievable during 1914. Rather, it was maneuverability, especially during the turn and the rate of climb. All of these aircraft and others were put up against the Albatros and other C-type scouts and earlier Fokker monoplanes. But there was another new aircraft coming out of the German factories, one which was to become possibly the most famous of World War I, due not to its performance, but the fact that it was the aircraft made famous by Baron Manfred von Richthofen and his flying circus, the Aster 11. Once again, it was the turn of Fokker to produce an aircraft that would regain air superiority for Germany. The new aircraft was the Fokker DR1 triplane. The legend which has grown around the Fokker triplane owes a great deal to its use by Manfred von Richthofen, and in fact his death whilst flying number 425/17 on the 21st of April 1918. Von Richthofen was quoted as praising the aircraft. It climbed like a monkey and maneuvered like the devil. Most pilots in Richthofen's Jagdgeschwader flew the aircraft until April 1918. During the first big air battle over Le Cateau on March the 18th, 1918, 60 German single-seater fighters took part. The majority of them were Fokker DR1 triplanes, one of which was 152/17, the aircraft flown by Manfred von Richthofen. Contrary to all the sensational claims by the Allies, von Richthofen's triplanes were perfectly standard aircraft and carried no more than the 2 regulation machine guns. Every weekend, one aircraft in particular draws the crowds to the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome in New York. Their original Fokker DR1 triplane, which has been restored to its original condition and still flies today in the colours of Manfred von Richthofen. Designed by Reinhold Platz, who was not entirely convinced of the merits of a triplane layout. With the shortage of powerful engine plants at the time, bearing in mind that the Mercedes 160 horsepower water-cooled engines had all been taken by the Albatros factory, Fokker decided to concentrate on rate of climb and maneuverability rather than speed. The Fokker triplane was the result. The Fokker machine was originally designated the Fokker F1 in 1917, but this was changed to Fokker DR, signifying Dreidecker or triplane. The length of the aircraft was only 5.7 meters, with a wingspan of 7.2 meters. From the ground to the top of the wing was 2.9 meters. The total area of wing surface which gave it its maneuverability and climbing ability was 18.7 square meters. When the aircraft was unladen, it weighed 405 kilograms. When fully fueled and loaded, it weighed 585 kilograms. It was fitted with 2 standard regulation Spandau machine guns, which were synchronized to fire through the propeller, and each of these guns could be fired independently. With its triple bank of wings, its clean lines and almost total absence of wires and struts, it seemed to almost float in the air. To get airborne, the aircraft only needed 45 meters of airstrip. It took to the air with very little effort required from its pilot. In the hands of a master pilot, it was a supreme aircraft. When the new Fokker appeared on the Western Front, most of the German fighter pilots took to it instantly and were full of praise for its flying qualities. It was everything they wanted a fighter scout to be. It had a much superior rate of climb and it maneuvered superbly. Its instant response to its highly sensitive controls demanded no effort from the pilot whatsoever. A pilot could even make a completely flat turn in it, reversing direction in just 4 seconds without even banking the wings. So maneuverable was this aircraft in combat that many Allied pilots never got the opportunity to find out just how slow it was and how short a range the aircraft had. Fokker's triplane was the first fighting aeroplane to use a thick aerofoil section, which gave the machine gentle stall and excellent behavior at low speeds. In combat, the aircraft was extremely strong and could absorb a great amount of battle damage from enemy fire. This was notably through the fact that there were no bracing wires that could be shot away. It could hit speeds of 160 kilometers an hour plus at low level and could climb at a spectacular rate of 1,000 meters in just 2 minutes and only 10 minutes to 4,000 meters to a maximum ceiling of over 6,000 meters. In von Richthofen's autobiography, he recalled, "Flying the triplane for the first time in combat, I and 4 gentlemen of Staffel 11 attacked a very courageously flown British artillery spotting aircraft. I approached until it was 50 meters below me and fired 20 shots, whereupon the adversary went down out of control and crashed on this side of the lines near Sonneberg. Apparently the adversary had mistaken me for a British Sopwith triplane, as the observer had stood up in his machine without making a move to attack me with his machine gun." This victory was logged as Richthofen's 60th, and it was the very first one he'd accomplished in a Fokker triplane. 2 days later, Richthofen scored another victory, again in his triplane, when JG-1's morning patrol jumped a flight of British Sopwith pups of No. 46 Squadron over Mini. Although Richthofen was flying the triplane, the rest of the squadron were flying Albatros DVs. The British had crossed over the line and were about 5 kilometers from Richthofen's own airfield when they were attacked. The effect of the air battle that followed was later described by Englishman Lieutenant Arthur Gold-Lee, who later became an Air Vice Marshal of the Royal Air Force. The news is not good. The squadron has taken a hammering, first patrol quickly ran into trouble. 5 of the A flight met Richthofen Circus and had a hectic battle. The pups were completely outclassed by the Albatros DVs, and most of their share of the fighting was spent trying to avoid being hit rather than shooting at the enemy. 2 of our pilots were seen to go down over enemy lines. I think a third might have gone down over our side. The 2 pilots that managed to get away but were badly shot up stated that one of the enemy was flying a bright red triplane. It must have been one of our Sopwiths which had been captured. In fact, one of Richthofen's fellow pilots had shot down the first Sopwith pup, and Richthofen had followed by shooting the second, which he then forced to land in German-held territory. Richthofen's determination was tempered by respect to his British adversary, as was often the case with Richthofen and his squadron. Richthofen recalled, "I was absolutely convinced that in front of me I had a very skillful pilot, who even at 50 meters altitude did not give up the fight, but continued to fire, and even when flapping out before landing, fired again at one of our infantry columns before deliberately steering his machine into a tree. I'm convinced now that the Fokker triplane is absolutely superior to the British Sopwith." The Fokker triplane was the vehicle of von Richthofen's immortality, but also his death. It was in fact only ever used by a few units, and used in relatively small numbers, with a total of 320 ever being produced, and only 171 operating in frontline service at any one time. Whilst there's no doubt that this was a fine fighting machine in the hands of an expert such as von Richthofen, to the less gifted pilots, it was an unforgiving machine and suffered structural weaknesses which could tell its operational career. Although the landing speeds were low, it was very difficult for the pilot to see the ground below, his vision being hindered by the lower wing. Many pilots experienced more than uncomfortable landings. The long-awaited triplanes did not prove to be the wonder weapons that German fighter pilots hoped they would be. A series of incidents, including one with Manfred von Richthofen's brother, Lothar, when his aircraft appeared to come apart in the air, raised questions about the new fighters. In November 1917, all of the Fokker triplanes were grounded, pending a complete investigation into structural problems that had resulted in tragic accidents. There were also further operational problems, as Richthofen, amongst others, felt that owing to the poor quality of oil that was available, the rotary engine was no longer suitable. Despite its shortfalls, opinions amongst those that flew them were varied. Hauptmann von Tutschek claimed that the Fokker DR-1 was superior in dogfighting to any contemporary Allied fighter, better even than the 200 horsepower Spad single-seater. He claimed to have put his own machine into a near vertical dive until it reached its terminal velocity in excess of 240 kilometers an hour. This was just possible, but not very probable. Ernst Udet stated in early 1918 that to him the Fokker triplane seemed to be the ideal fighter aeroplane. He regarded it as superior to the Sopwith Camel in maneuverability and in rate of climb. Less enthusiastic were those pilots who were built on more generous lines than the average model. The cockpit was not built for any long-legged pilots, and another criticism was the poor view when taking off or touching down, because the fuselage was short and the undercarriage tall. During the latter part of 1917 and early 1918, these and many other pilots like them enjoyed a period of air superiority over the enemy. The distinctive colours of von Richthofen's legendary blood-red flying machine have gone down in the annals of aviation history, and although he actually scored 59 of his victories flying a red Albatros, the Fokker triplane has become known as Richthofen's trademark. This replica of Richthofen's machine is flown by a Canadian company at air shows and displays all over the United States of America. One of the pilots who flies this aircraft, a veteran with some 60 years of flying experience, recalls, "Of all the machines that I've ever flown, the triplane remains in my memory as being the best for the actual pleasure of flying an aircraft that I have ever taken up. It was so beautifully balanced, so well-mannered, so feather-light on the stick, and so comfortable and warm for its docility. It needed the minimum amount of effort to fly it, and yet its instantaneous response to the lightest touch, it remains my favorite. I have flown other machines from World War I which were faster, much stronger, more reliable, and had much better rates of climb and better all-round vision, but none was so friendly as the triplane. If you think about it, the triplane layout has such obvious advantages. It puzzles me why other designers did not make more use of it. The arrangement, once airborne, gives the pilot superb visibility. All three wings are very narrow, whilst the top and bottom wings are far above and below your line of sight, and the center wing is so inline that it obscures very little of the sky. The short wingspan means you can achieve a quick rate of roll, and the narrow wings mean only the smallest travel of the center of pressure with changing speed, so the triplane can have a short fuselage, which enables the pilot to do marvelous things with maneuverability, especially in turning. About the only disadvantage is the interference drag of the triple wing. One should not make the mistake of looking at the designs of World War I aeroplanes as being backward or old-fashioned. It is doubtful, bearing in mind the engines that were then available, that a modern aircraft designer could do any better. Whilst a piston or jet engine is of course much more reliable than those old rotary engines, the power-to-weight ratios are not notably better. And I'd much rather fly in one of the old triplanes than one of today's modern jet fighters. It just gave you the sheer enjoyment of flying without having to worry about how. The German Fokker and Albatros fighting scouts were enjoying air superiority once again, the British had another aircraft coming out of the factories, which they hoped would turn the tide in their favour, the Sopwith Camel. This was a biplane fighter with a powerful 180 horsepower engine and an airframe of immense strength compared to its adversaries. In the hands of an expert, although difficult to fly, the Sopwith Camel was one of the best British fighters of the war, and soon earned respect from the German pilots for its potent ability. It was a Sopwith Camel that von Richthofen was chasing in April 1918 when he was shot down over enemy lines. It was also a Sopwith Camel that claimed the victory for shooting him down, although there is still doubt as to whether he was hit by another fighter or ground fire from the infantry on the ground. Camels were also used as fighter bombers attacking ground troops in the trenches. Not only did they give tactical support, but also gained valuable intelligence on enemy positions. It seemed that once again the role of air superiority was changing. The British Camels and the French Spads were winning many aerial victories over the German triplanes and Albatros Scouts. They were also beginning to venture further into enemy territory in ever-increasing daring raids. Germany, however, had yet another ace card up her sleeve, and once again this was to come out of the Fokker aircraft factory. It was in fact Manfred von Richthofen, the put this brand new Fokker to the test at flight trials in January 1918. This aircraft from Fokker had one advantage over his previous aircraft, for his new prototype had the powerful Mercedes engine. Von Richthofen had flown the new Fokker once before, with not very impressive results. However, with some slight modifications, he was asked to test it once again. The result was that von Richthofen found it a delight to fly, and completely free of any problems or necessary adjustments or modifications. Fokker was immediately asked to build 400 of the new planes, and furthermore, the factories of Albatros and AEG were also ordered to build even more on license from Fokker. This aircraft made Fokker a millionaire overnight. The new aircraft was the devastating Fokker D7, unquestionably one of the best fighting aircraft of all time. It is said that war spurs the rapid advancement of many things. This was certainly true in the case of this new aircraft to come off the Fokker production lines. The first combat version of the Fokker D7 was delivered to the famous squadron of von Richthofen only 2 months after the first prototype trials. Although von Richthofen had flown the aircraft on tests and had approved it, he continued to use his legendary Fokker triplane, in which he later died. News spread very fast amongst the Allied pilots that there was a new aeroplane which would rekindle the dreaded Fokker scourge. This Fokker D7 is another of the restored aircraft flown at Old Rheinbeck in New York. This single-seat biplane was generally regarded as being Germany's finest fighting scout of the First World War. One pilot who flew this aircraft, which is one of the few remaining in the world today, wrote, "The aircraft flew like a puff of warm air. It would break ground on takeoff almost of its own accord, without nosing up or making any real effort. It would just float away." It was probably the easiest of all the First World War fighters to fly, and with its exceptional characteristic of its rapid rate of turn, it would outturn any of the Allied types. It will hang at about 45 degrees at low speeds and still be in full flight and very controllable. The engine was reliable, although the Mercedes was a little underpowered at high altitude. It would start itself without a starter. You didn't have to crank it. Even more unbelievably, the aircraft is still flying today, some 80 years after it was built, and is still running on the original spark plugs. Here was a seemingly magical aeroplane with strange, thick wings and almost no struts. It seemed to be able to stand still in mid-air whilst spitting a deadly stream of lead from its twin Spandau machine guns into the soft, unprotected underbelly of its victims as they desperately struggled to climb out of its range. After the initial deliveries to Jagdgeschwader 1 in April 1918, Jagdstaffeln 26, 2, 27, 36 and 3 were fully equipped with the D7 during the month of May. The pilots were delighted with their new mounts and their victory scores mounted. On May the 1st, 19 of them were in active service. 2 months later, the total reached 407, and 2 months after that, there were 828 of these machines plaguing the Allied pilots. After the first 3 months of operational use, the standard version with a high-compression Mercedes engine ceased to be adequate to deal with the opposing Allied types, such as the British Sopwith Camel, American Curtiss, and the French Nieuport. In particular, this shortfall was in its performance at high altitude. Above 4,500 meters, the maneuverability deteriorated. This was soon overcome by fitting a BMW 185 horsepower engine, which had a much better high-altitude performance and was considerably faster. The new version was, of course, much sought after, but only limited production of the engines was available, so the majority of the airframes had the Mercedes power plant. There were other criticisms of the aircraft amongst pilots. These related mainly to the bad manufacturing by the Fokker factory. The fuel tanks would open at the seams, and even more serious operational trouble was caused by the overheating of the ammunition boxes in flight. This resulted in several of the aircraft bursting into flames in the sky. Enemy action could be excluded as a cause. Some pilots have been able to land their burning aircraft and to prove beyond doubt that the fire originated from phosphorus ammunition. A new kind of incendiary armor-piercing ammunition had been introduced, but this was not the cause of the trouble. On July the 17th, incendiary ammunition was forbidden for use on the D-7 aircraft. When the Fokker D-7 appeared on the Western Front, it created a sensation amongst Allied pilots. Lacking the more graceful lines of the Albatros and Pfalz Scouts, looked at first sight to be clumsy and inferior. But it was not long before two-seater crews brought back startling accounts of the new German fighter that appeared to be able to stand still in the air with its nose up and pour a stream of bullets into the two-seater from a blind spot. Although von Richthofen was regarded as being a champion of the Fokker triplane, he did have a very high regard for the new Fokker D7. In 1918, he wrote in a letter to the High Command at Berlin, "After a long time, I come up once again with a question. When can I count on receiving the new Fokker biplanes? The superiority of the British single-seater makes it increasingly more unpleasant here at the front. The need has become very urgent now. One could shoot down 5 times as many enemy planes if we were so equipped. So please, give me news about when we can count on receiving the new machines." D7s were delivered to Richthofen in April of 1918. The Allied pilots that managed to escape from their encounters with the new Fokker were inclined to possibly overrate its ability in speed and climb. The Fokker could not, of course, stand still in the air. German pilots had quickly learned how to exploit the qualities of the thick wing section, which stalled gradually and at a rather high angle of attack. Thus, for the first time, they could approach a two-seater from below where the observer could not bring his guns to bear and make their attacks with the Fokker in an almost stalled condition with full throttle and nose high. This maneuver was safe and simple, for the aircraft was not prone to fall in a spin. In fact, the Fokker D7 needed skill and forceful handling to compel it to fall into a spin. When it did so, the motion was steep, with its nose well down, and even easier for the pilots, the aircraft tended to come out of a spin of its own accord. Clear evidence of the high regard that the Allies had for this aircraft was in the fact that in the armistice surrender terms, the Fokker D7 was the only specifically named German aeroplane that was demanded by the Allies to be immediately surrendered. When America entered the war, their air force in terms of power ranked a mere 14th in the world. In this short piece of film, we see how American airmen were trained from novices to pilots within a few weeks. They were far from ready, with only a handful of trained aviators and a great many new conscripts. They were given wooden guns to train with until the real thing could be produced in enough numbers. Within a few weeks, however, things were different. For training equipment, they molded their own bombs out of plastic. The American war effort got underway, and the factories began turning out the weapons, including these Lewis machine guns. The new aviators, having passed the required preliminary tests, were issued with leather flying kit and helmets. They were then given their assignments and the chance to be able to fly for the first time. They were given 50 hours of flying time in the air before being given their wings. These 50 hours included bombing and fighting practice. In 1916, there had been a few trained American pilots flying with France. They were the famous Latier escadrilles, started by Norman Prince, William Thaw, Victor Champion and Bert Hall, who courageously fought when Germany had full control of the skies over Europe. Factories all over America started to produce aircraft in large numbers. The Americans considered that if this war was to be over quickly, it would be done by sheer mass of manpower and equipment. The aircraft fuselage which they chose was a British design, the engine was American. The manufacture was the outstanding production achievement of the war. In all, 4,500 VH-4 aircraft powered by the Liberty engine were built in America. They were built by Ford, Lincoln, Cadillac and Packard automobile manufacturers. Curtiss, Martin and Wright, still famous plane-making names, were busy assembly plants in those days. World War I gave America a great aircraft industry. Each plane was test-flown, then thousands of parts were painstakingly dismantled for packing under guard, crated and addressed, and off to the front. In France, the aircraft parts were unpacked in order to be reassembled into the fighting craft, which would be put up against the mighty German Fokkers. May 1918, the first American DH-4s rolled directly from assembly sheds to the airfields. Only 8 months after they were ordered into production, they joined American aviators ready for the big push. When the order to prepare for battle was given, truckloads of aerial bombs were delivered to the planes, where air armorers fused the bombs and loaded the racks. Then the pilots who had to take them up made sure the job was done right. This was going to be part of what became known as the Big Push. It was a September morning in 1918 when everything was ready. The British, French and Americans had asked for every Allied airplane that could fight. The Allies wanted the largest air force possible to control the skies over the Saint-Mihiel sector. This was one of the main fields of battle. Every Allied field on the continent gave its planes. The orders had called for 1,500. They actually got 1,481 off the ground. The wooden props spit into the air and the engines began to rev up. This was going to be one of the biggest air battles of the war, and the plan was to outnumber German aircraft by 3 to 1. Some had orders to bomb and strafe German installations, others to engage the Fokkers and Albatros fighters in the air. Germany put up everything they could in a bold and courageous fight, but by this time in the war, the sheer weight of their opponent's force in terms of men and aircraft was overwhelming. The sky was a beehive of battle, both sides struggling to achieve air superiority over their opponents. By the end of the war, the feats of men like these had caught the admiration of the general public on both sides, the exploits of the great fighter aces. The Frenchman Georges Guillemot became a national hero, as did Nungesser and Fogg. Shy 20-year-old Albert Ball was one of many British aces. Once the United States entered the war, the Americans too produced their aces, like Eddie Rickenbacker and Raoul Lufbery, who began his flying career as a volunteer with the French. But Germany probably had the greatest, men such as Max Immermann, Oswald Bolke, Voss and Ernst Udet. But probably the greatest ace of the war was Baron Manfred von Richthofen. These men and the machines they flew have all now become legends in the annals of aviation history.